If you think that had Napoleon won at the Battle of Waterloo, nothing would have been changed, you would be very wrong. As a spoiler to what is going to happen in this video, Italy might not get unified in the near future, with France maybe even becoming communist in 1871. Going back to Napoleon Bonaparte, in the War of the Seventh Coalition or the 100 Days, it would still see Napoleon be defeated eventually, just not at Waterloo. Let me show you what would happen if Napoleon Bonaparte had won at the Battle of Waterloo, and how France would be in an even worse position than it is in our timeline. I won't get in detail regarding the Napoleonic Wars, as they're perhaps one of the most famous series of conflicts after the World Wars. What you need to know is that when Napoleon Bonaparte was defeated, he was exiled to the island of Elba. This was until he decided to return to Europe, gather forces and was ready to become the Emperor of France again. All of the major powers in Europe weren't having it, so they declared war on him personally, not on France. This tension culminated in the Battle of Waterloo, where Napoleon made the mistake of waiting for the ground to dry up, instead of just facing the British. This waiting around cost him dearly, as the Prussians were able to support the British, so Napoleon couldn't win. Had Napoleon not waited and defeated Britain, which is not guaranteed, but for the sake of this video, let's say that he does, then he would face the Prussians and defeat them too, classic divide and conquer. Now I assume that all of the European powers would decide not to risk any more soldiers and just let Napoleon be Emperor of France, and then his son Napoleon III. I'm kidding, of course, no way this would happen. So the coalition against Napoleon would just hunt him down and eventually secure a victory. So what's next? We're barely 2 minutes into the video and I gave you the whole point of the divergence. Now we're going into the alternate history part. Regarding what will change, there would be a couple of things, but one really important. First, I assume that Napoleon Bonaparte would still get exiled to St. Helena, unless the British decide to let him live in the second worst place in the world, London. Second after Bulgaria, by the way, if you're wondering. So, the big change that would happen this time, considering that Napoleon Bonaparte returned from exile the first time and kicked the coalition initially away from France, is that no member of the Bonaparte dynasty would be allowed to rule France. Never. As a result, Austria, Prussia, Russia and the United Kingdom would put it into their constitutions that if there is a Bonaparte on the throne of France, they have the right to invade. On the other hand, France would also ban any Bonapartist from rising to power, within their own constitution, and they will try their best to suppress the glory of Napoleon Bonaparte. Okay, so who cares? Well, this guy, Napoleon III. He was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte and became the first president of France and the last emperor of France. He is so important that his face was put on the French currency. This is 50 centimes coin from 1865, and it was minted in the city of Strasbourg, the very same city France would lose to Germany 5 years later. Napoleon III ruled France for 22 years, from 1848 to 1870. Getting him out of the picture leaves us with 22 years of blank canvas we can work with, which should allow for some really interesting scenarios. Again, let me remind you that France and the other great powers would prevent any Bonapartist from rising to power, which means no Napoleon III. Let me tell you some of the things that were initiated by Napoleon III, so you can understand what getting him out of the picture would mean for France, as well as what could have happened. Most people know Napoleon III for losing pretty badly against Prussia. He was tricked into declaring war and appearing as the aggressor. And then, months after the start of the war, he was captured in Sedan, together with his massive army. Videntis, another fellow alternate history YouTuber, made a poll in which most people agree that Napoleon III was good for France, despite his hiccup. Napoleon III modernized France, as he greatly improved Paris as a city, introducing modern infrastructure and improving the economy. Transportation in general was improved in the whole of France, as you could sail between Marseille and Le Havre with steamships. This naval development made France the second largest navy in the world after Great Britain. Napoleon III also backed the greatest maritime project of the age, the construction of the Suez Canal, which started in 1859 and finished 10 years later. Regarding the foreign policy, France was involved in 3 big conflicts, these being the Crimean War, the wars of the Italian unification, and the second French intervention in Mexico. This means that without Napoleon III initiating these conflicts, maybe they don't happen, or are greatly altered. So in a way, with Napoleon Bonaparte winning at Waterloo in 1815, results in the Crimean War not to happen 38 years later. From the start of his empire, Napoleon III sought an alliance with Britain, so getting him out of the picture would maybe mean that France is hostile to Britain. But before we get into what would change, let's see who would even replace Napoleon III. As I mentioned before, he was the first president of France, as in 1848 there were revolutions across all of Europe. This impacted France and resulted in them abolishing their monarchy and to start the Second French Republic, with the best possible flag. In the election of 1848, Napoleon III got 74.33% out of the vote. with Louis-Eugene Cavagneux getting 19.81%. I think that it's fair to say that if Napoleon III is out of the picture, then Louis-Eugene Cavagneux would win this election. In fact, Louis-Eugene ruled the Second French Republic for a few months before the elections, so his likelihood of winning is very possible. Louis-Eugene was a moderate Republican, so we can apply their ideology for a few years, as predicting who would win the next election is close to impossible. So France would become liberal for a few years, with it being unlikely that any wars would come up in the near future. The Crimean War can be very much altered, and without Napoleon III initiating for it, it might not even happen. The second French intervention in Mexico is also out of the question in my opinion, but the events of the Italian unification can be very much altered. Historically, what happened is that Napoleon III helped Victor Emmanuel II of Sardinia-Piedmont to unify most of Italy. This was done by fighting Austria over northern Italian holdings, this being Lombardy-Veneto. France and Sardinia-Piedmont were victorious in this conflict, so Sardinia-Piedmont soon unified all of Italy with the help of Giuseppe Garibaldi. On the other hand, France had received the provinces of Savoy and Nice as compensation for helping out Sardinia-Piedmont. Italy, however, was not fully unified. The Papal States were about to exist, with France protecting their independence from Italy, who they just helped unify. The Italians fully unified when France and Prussia went to war. As a result, the French garrison left the Papal States, so Italy freely invaded. Now I bet that all of these events would be very different, as the Republicans, under Louis-Eugene, were in opposition to the Catholic Church due to their differences of ideas. As a result, if Italy were to unite, the Papal States will most likely not be spared and join Italy 10 years earlier. Regarding the Republican faction in France during the 1850s, apparently they were very split up and broken into smaller factions. As a result, we can expect a weaker and more indecisive France. We can also expect a far weaker France in terms of their military, as in 1851, Louis-Eugene was opposed to France intervening in foreign affairs, especially when France suppressed the revolutionary Roman Republic. Historically, in April of 1859, Sardinia-Piedmont allied with France, which resulted in a French and Sardinian victory against the Austrians. This time, this will change. France might not even intervene in this, but it's unlikely. Louis-Eugene historically died in 1857, so somebody else, who is very difficult to predict who exactly would be, would most likely see the benefit of France intervening in Italy. This time it wouldn't go as well for the French as it did in our timeline. This is because, without Napoleon III's major reforms, Paris would still be a massive swamp. France won't have a strong navy, and their military would be neglected. Let's not forget that the ruling party was too fragmented, so they wouldn't be able to agree on anything pretty much. This would include anything regarding the military too, so the French army wouldn't improve in the years leading up to the war, unlike in our timeline. I think it's fair to say that France and Sardinia-Piedmont could lose against Austria, considering all of those circumstances. Now, you may say that this is unrealistic, but let me tell you what the other alternative is. The other alternative is that they succeed and Prussia and France later end up being at war, resulting in another French defeat. So this alternate history merges with our reality. To prevent that, I say that the French lose, or at least stalemate. It doesn't matter much for France as their territory was not on the line if they lose. It would be only Sardinia-Piedmont who would lose land if they do. Maybe Austria will puppet Sardinia-Piedmont, as this is not the first time that Sardinia-Piedmont fought Austria over the Apennine Peninsula. Maybe Austria removes the House of Savoy from power and installs the House of Habsburg. No matter what, France wouldn't be affected in this. What would happen is that France would most likely get Nice and Savoy provinces from Sardinia-Piedmont. It's possible that Austria gives them these lands just to keep the balance of power intact, but I really doubt that. France can maybe compensate it with more colonies or influence somewhere. Again, the butterfly effect is really interesting, as Napoleon Bonaparte winning at Waterloo would mean that Italy doesn't unite, with their unification looking like it's not going to happen anytime soon. Historically, France also participated in putting down the Taiping Rebellion, but I don't think that them not participating would be the deciding factor. What is more relevant is the Second Opium War, in which France again might not participate, which would result in weaker French presence abroad, especially in Asia. Now we get to the meat of the video, the Franco-Prussian War. As a prelude to that conflict, Austria lost to Prussia in the Brothers' War of 1866, allowing Prussia to unite all the North German speakers under one country, the North German Confederation. With Austria not losing their Italian influence, maybe they stand a chance against Prussia, but this is for another alternate history scenario. In this timeline, Austria-Hungary would still lose. This would result in the Franco-Prussian War to happen the same way as it did in our timeline. Maybe it's more difficult due to bureaucracy for France to declare war, as again, the Republican faction might not agree to it. Maybe this war happens with a crisis in Luxembourg. But for simplicity, let's say it happens the same way as it did historically. Keep in mind that here we're starting to get too unrealistic. We're 20 years deep into this alternate history, so many things could have been changed, especially the French leadership. Due to France having an election every 4 years, it would become impossible to know who would be the president by the time of the Franco-Prussian War. This time, France would also be defeated, but in a different way. This is because Napoleon III was encircled in Sedan pretty early into the war, together with his entire army. This led to his surrender, but the rest of France didn't back down. They mobilized and the war continued for another year, but without any success. It made the conflict longer, so as a result, Paris was occupied by the Prussian army. But before Paris was occupied, it was besieged and the conditions were brutal. The temperature was negative 15 degrees Celsius, with the Seine freezing for 3 weeks. Messages were delivered to the city only through balloons or carrier pigeons. The Germans decided it was time to end this war, so they bombarded Paris heavily. Around 300 to 600 shells landed in the center of the city each day. There was no food in Paris and the conditions were brutal. The National Guard was a volunteer militia who was tasked with defending Paris. Due to the horrible conditions I just mentioned, many within the army and population were radicalized, which led to the rise of the Paris Commune. The reason why the Paris Commune failed historically was because they were all alone to fight militarily against all of France, but this could have been very well changed. In Marseille and Lyon, which were French major cities, there was a noticeable communist community, so had they risen up, things could have been different. The government of France in this alternate timeline would be even more incompetent. As a result, the common Frenchman would want change. Now that France would be defeated against Prussia, it would be unacceptable for the same government to remain in charge. Even a monarchy is a compromise, considering the many revolutions that France has had against monarchy rule. Monarchy failed in France, and the Republic failed in France. The other alternative was the communist ideology. Another way on how the Paris Commune can succeed if they were somehow supported by Germany. By the time of the Paris Commune, Germany occupied most of northern France, because they were waiting to get paid their war reparations. This means that Germany could have supported the Paris Commune just to make the alternative French government weaker, and to hopefully start a civil war in France, weakening their rival forever. All of these reasons I just gave you, I think makes it very likely for France to have a massive communist revolution. Considering how disappointing the French Republic would be, I think that the communists would prevail. Let me remind you that the Republic failed to extend France, but they also failed to unite Italy in the war against Prussia. Now, the Paris Commune is even more unlikely to predict how it would look like. Historically, they didn't have a strong ideology. Instead, they were a coalition of many left-leaning parties, but they did include some center-right parties. It was unknown if the Paris Commune would become anarchist, communist, socialist, etc. I'm really curious if you think that all of these things I just mentioned about Napoleon Bonaparte winning the Battle of Waterloo and what happened after that are realistic. I do believe that all that I outlined makes sense, although it's very unholy. Perhaps it's realistic. This is why I want to introduce a new concept on my channel, the realistic alternate history meter. If you want to take part in this idea, just comment realism and a number from 1 to 10 depending on how realistic the video you think is, with 1 being the most unrealistic and 10 being the most realistic. You can try this concept right now in the comment section, or simply in the video on the screen, where Monaco managed to form France with Napoleon III betting the entire nation of France on a casino game. I hope to see you there.